2008, 2009, when I was 13 or 14, I'd just started a new habit of staying up very late. I'd sit in my room with the clock radio playing some tunes while I sat in bed doodling all night. I can't pinpoint exactly when it started, but one of those nights, my radio began making this jacked up noise. Like a distorted, terrible noise over the faint sound of music struggling to be heard. I immediately hated it, but changing the station did nothing. This went on for a few minutes and just stopped. I quickly shrugged it off. And then it kept happening. Every night. For a few minutes, the radio would just go nuts. If I wasn't being lazy, I'd get up and turn it down for a while. Most nights, regardless of how much it bothered me, I'd usually just suffer through it. It occurred to me that it seemed to always happen around the same time, so I curiously paid attention one evening. At 3:30 exactly, on this little clock, it started, and it didn't stop until it turned 3:34. So for a solid 3 minutes, this would go on. I was aware that there was some sort of significance to 3 a.m., and though I wasn't the type of person to believe in that kind of thing, still, it made me feel really uneasy. It felt so intentional. So I paid attention more nights. Every single night, 3:30 to 3:34, it happened. I tried telling my family. No one believed me or bothered to listen to my off-putting rants. You know how in horror movies, the adults, they never listen to the kids blatantly calling things out. You ever thought that was unrealistic? Well, it isn't. Everyone else in my house was asleep by 3 a.m. Until finally one night, my older brother and his best friend were awake, long enough for me to convince one of them, the friend, to please come check this out. He acknowledged the strange sound and literally said, "I'm not fucking with that," and left. I started just turning the radio off and hanging out in the game room, but every time 3:30 rolled around, I was on edge. One night, once again alone, I was sitting at the desktop computer, trolling, whatever, when I hear what sounds like an avalanche falling in my kitchen right below me. The game room was upstairs and overlooked the living room, which connected to the kitchen. Completely open space. I heard what I assumed was every pot and pan in our kitchen simultaneously falling out of the cabinets. My first assumption was our cat was up to no good and knocked something over. But as I descended down the stairs in the pitch-black abyss of the ground floor, I thought, what if someone's breaking in? I run to switch on the light, but nothing. No cat, no pans, no mess. Everything's perfectly fine. I was so confused. I even looked around to make sure, but I had zero explanation. And I know for a fact the kitchen was the source of the noise. The last minor thing I can recall, but not the last thing. This was an incident where I was on the phone with my best friend, and mid-call, the phone went absolutely nuts.
Hello?
The call cut out and just screeched and gargled.
Hello?
I can't quite describe it, but I've never stared at something in pure terror like that before. It was a landline, and it's not like something similar hasn't occurred, but this was different. Just awful. I didn't even call her back. I just left, walked down the street to her house. Fuck this shit. Finally, the kitchen again. It's a Saturday evening, and previously mentioned best friend was over at my place. My mom was on a date. It's probably important to mention my dad had died in 2007. Well, it was around 7 or 8 p.m. We're making snacks when we hear my mom's car pull up. Keep in mind, we've been hanging out in the kitchen for at least 20 minutes, and we had light-colored floors. We go to meet them at the door. We're all headed back to the kitchen, my best friend and I highly anticipating the leftovers we're about to steal. Upon entering the kitchen, we all notice spots of blood on the floor. 20 or so nickel-sized spots of blood sporadically on the ground, all contained around the general area in front of the stove. My mom, being a mom, says, "Check your feet. It looks like one of you are bleeding." My friend was still in her socks. No blood. I check my feet, perfectly unbothered. My mom looks for the cat, asleep on the couch. Probably hadn't moved for hours. We couldn't find the source. We even looked at the ceiling, just in case. My mom's boyfriend wiped some up on a paper towel and sniffed it. "This is definitely blood," he said. Mom just cleaned it up. She even made some remark about how we were probably just trying to scare them. To this day, my friend, whom I'm still very close with, brings it up like, "Yo, you remember that time there was blood all over your kitchen? Like, seriously, what the fuck was that? Your house was haunted, dude." On top of these things, I just felt awful. I was already depressed, dead dad and shit. I started having terrible, vivid nightmares almost every night. I no longer slept in my bed. I created a sort of safe haven in my closet. After everyone went to bed for the night, I was always on edge. Another night of me snuggled up in my closet, I was listening to my radio and time somehow escaped me. The radio did its thing and I was done. I felt terrorized, targeted, and afraid. I just started crying. I hated it. Whatever it was, I just absolutely despised it. I begged it to stop. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of, "Stop, stop, stop, please stop, for fuck's sake, leave me alone, please." And it did. 3:32. I'll never forget it. Radio went back to singing clearly. If anything strange happened after that, I didn't bother noticing. A while later, when my mom was in her messier stage of grieving, after distracting herself with dating and work had failed, she was drinking herself to death on the couch again and brought up the blood in the kitchen to me. "You remember when we saw all that blood in the kitchen? You know what that reminded me of? Your dad. When he was almost gone and the diabetes was taking him, his feet would split and bleed, and I'd have to clean up all the little spots of blood that he'd leave behind. Oh, what a terrible time for us." This requires a little backstory. When I was born, it was just me and my mom, and because of this, I became quite clingy. She was the only one that I had and the only person that I really knew. And I developed extreme separation anxiety whenever I wasn't around her. So in order to sleep in my own room, I needed her to come in and say goodnight. And often, I would sneak into her room in the middle of the night and sleep there. Every night, I would yell for her to come into my room, and she would sit on the edge of my bed, reassure me that I was safe, turn off the lamp next to my bed, and close the door, leaving it just cracked enough where a little bit of light would shine through from the hallway. Her bedroom was quite literally across the hallway from mine, so when I would wake up in the middle of the night, scared, I'd slowly creak open my door and easily walk over to her room. I'd always know she was there because her door was cracked the same way mine was. When I was around 3 years old, she got remarried, which meant I couldn't sneak into her room quite as often. So her coming in and saying goodnight was a crucial part of me being able to sleep. I remember this night so clearly. I was around 4 or 5 years old. I get into bed, my lamp is on, and my door is wide open. I yell for my mom like I did every night, and no response. This wasn't necessarily unusual because sometimes she'd be in a different part of the house and I'd just have to yell a few more times before she could hear me. I yell and yell, but she never comes, and I start to become quite anxious. I remember my mind racing with fear. I thought something terrible must have happened for her to not hear me yelling for her, but I just kept yelling, "Mom? Mama?" I just kept yelling, and I began to cry when all of a sudden I see this woman enter my doorway. This woman was very misty, almost like a cloud, and all of a sudden this comfort feeling fell over me, and I stopped crying. She stood in my doorway and smiled at me, then began waving her hand, motioning for me to come into the hallway. I then saw her slowly disappear. I got up and walked into the hallway, and she was gone. I see my mom's door wide open and no one inside. I then started to hear noise coming from the basement, which I couldn't hear from inside my room. I walk down to the basement and I see my mom and her husband watching a movie a little too loud, and when they see me, they pause it, and I can see my mom realize that she hadn't said goodnight yet. She then brings me upstairs and puts me to bed. I never really told anyone about this, but it's always something I remembered because of how she smiled at me, made me feel less scared. It was almost as if she was trying to tell me that my mom was fine, she just couldn't hear me. It's also something I learned from a young age that not all ghosts are scary or out to harm you. I've always appreciated that thought.